In this lesson, we're going to take a look at Nitro and H3. So throughout this course, and also in the docs and other places in your Nuxt app, you may have seen mention of Nitro or H3. It can be a little bit confusing to understand what they are and what they do and how they're useful to us when we're developing Nuxt applications. And so that's what we're going to dive into in this lesson. So in our Nuxt framework, we have Nitro, which is used internally by Nuxt. And in turn, Nitro uses H3 internally. So this gives you a better sense of the structure of what these packages are doing. At a very high level, H3 is responsible for HTTP requests. So when a GET request or a PUT request comes into your application, it is H3 that's responsible for running the server middleware and then the appropriate event handler. Nitro uses H3 internally and layers on a ton of extra functionality, such as file-based routing and bundling and code splitting and all of that goodness. Then in turn, Nuxt uses Nitro to provide the backend for our applications. So we're going to start with H3. So as I said, it's a minimal HTTP framework. And if we come over to our project, we can actually see it being used. So if we come to this lesson slug endpoint, we define our event handler, and this is actually an H3 method where we define the H3 event handler. And the event that comes in that we are responding to is an H3 event. But what Nuxt is doing here is providing this to us and exposing this to us in a very simple way, so we don't have to really understand H3. But if we do understand H3, we can dig deeper into it and get more value out of it. If we look at our protect route server middleware, we'll also see that the type that we've used for this event here is an H3 event. And we've had to import this from the H3 package directly. If you've ever had experience with Express for building Node backends or Koa or other similar frameworks, you'll be quite familiar with how H3 works. The difference is that H3 is designed to be as minimal and as fast and as tree shakeable as possible, so we can build lightweight applications. H3 is also built so that it operates in a very similar way to the composition API. Although on the backend, we're not doing anything with reactivity because the request comes in, and once we run through the code, we return and exit out of that context. So reactivity doesn't really help us there. But the way that you write event handlers in H3 feels very similar to the composition API because of these composable-like utilities. And we haven't used very many of these yet, but in the next chapter, we'll actually see a bunch of these in action. So we have utilities like read body, which lets us read the body of the request, get query, set cookie, which lets us set the cookie on the response. So to give you a bit more context into how H3 works, I'm here on the GitHub page for it. And you can see that here's a basic example of setting up an event handler for this root endpoint. So this API will only return hello world. And so that's all that it really does. You can also see that we are able to create our own routers and do more complex routing. We are lucky in that we don't have to write any of this code because Nitro writes this code for us, which we'll see in just a moment. Here we've got a list of all the different utilities that we have. And so you can see that we can write them in the very, very similar way to writing the composition API. So it feels like we're writing in the composition API. And so we're not having to switch between very different ways of writing code when we're going from the front end to the back end. And so the whole experience is a bit more cohesive because of that. If you want to dig deeper into how these work and their API, you can click over to the JS docs documentation. I often find that I can't find this again, but to get back here, what you need to do is just go to the H3 GitHub repo, scroll down to the utilities section, and then there's this link here. And here we get the entire signature of the different types that it's expecting and a little bit more detail on how to use them. And of course, if you want to dig even further, you can click right into the code and explore that further if you want. So H3 provides us with the HTTP framework. We can listen to requests and then respond to them. We can run middleware on those requests, but that's not nearly enough for us to build the back end of our application. We need to be able to handle SSR, pre-rendering. We need to be able to handle caching. We need to be able to bundle our code so that we can deploy it. And there's many other things that we need to do in order to build a full application. And that's where Nitro comes in. It's a universal JavaScript server that uses H3 to handle HTTP requests. The universal comes because it is able to be run in any environment, whether it's a deployment site like Netlify or Vercel, or on edge workers. And it can also work with any front-end framework. It's not tied specifically to Vue. So Nitro gives us the ability to do SSR, to do static generation. It also builds on top of H3 to give us file-based routing. It will look at our file system and translate that into the routes that H3 then uses. It will auto-configure itself for many different hosting providers so that it will be optimally run when you deploy it. And it's also responsible for building the application. But one cool thing that Nitro does is that it doesn't require any extra code. There's no npm install here. It bundles the server into one bundle of JavaScript that can be run on its own. It's entirely self-contained. It also deals with code splitting and will automatically do that for us based on our routes and any configuration that we have if we're using Vite or Webpack. It also adds on a storage layer so that we can access the file system, access a database, and uses this storage layer, among other things, to implement a caching system so that we can optimize our application's backend. So there's a lot of stuff that Nitro does, a lot of things that we haven't even covered in this course because it goes well beyond the fundamentals of building an application in Nuxt. But there's a lot of power here that you can leverage if you choose to dive into it. So here's the diagram from before where we've got Nuxt that uses Nitro and Nitro that uses H3. H3 is only there to handle the HTTP requests that come in, and then it runs the appropriate event handler to respond to those HTTP requests. Nitro builds on top of H3 and adds on all of the extra functionality that is required to build a backend. In turn, Nuxt uses Nitro, adds on all sorts of Vue-specific integrations and other functionality so that we get the framework that we know and love. One last thing that I wanted to mention is that Nitro and H3 are these standalone packages that are actually part of a wider project called UnJS. So what the team at Nuxt Labs have done is, instead of building Nuxt 3 as this big monolithic project, they've broken it down into many, many different smaller packages that can be reused elsewhere in other projects. So we've seen that with H3 and with Nitro. You could build simpler applications using H3 if all you needed is a basic HTTP request framework. You could build your own version of Nuxt if you wanted to by taking Nitro and adding some extra functionality on top of it. But in general, UnJS is a collection of different packages like that are just for helping us to make JavaScript applications in general. One package that we haven't looked at is the hookable package. So in Vue, we've got lifecycle hooks that let us create these sort of plugins to extend how Vue works. Nuxt and Nitro also have a hook system so that we can create plugins that hook into the build process or when a page is rendered, and let us create plugins that extend that. That entire hook system is powered by this hookable package. So if you're building your own app, your own tooling, and you want to be able to write plugins for it to extend the behavior, this hookable package makes it very easy and simple to do that. The isometric fetch package that Nuxt is using is also an UnJS package. And if we go to their website, we can see in GitHub that there are a ton of different packages available. So we've seen H3 and Nitro, and we talked about the fetch package. But there's also Consola, which is a console logger. There's also IPX, which is a service for optimizing images. And if you look through here, we can see that there are tons and tons and tons of different packages that we can use. Now, not all of these will be relevant to you building a Nuxt 3 app, but I did think it was important to understand how these packages fit into the broader ecosystem. And perhaps one of these packages here is something that will help you with your application. In this lesson, we saw how Nuxt uses Nitro and H3 internally in order to power a large amount of its functionality. We saw how H3 is a simple HTTP request handler that is used by Nitro, and how Nitro adds on a bunch of extra functionality to create a universal JavaScript server that Nuxt can then use to create a wonderful Vue framework for us.